So I want to talk a little bit about interventions that are targeted towards behavioral changes. It's far more here than we can possibly talk about in a short lecture, but I do want to just give you a brief introduction to the topic. Little known fact is that Pavlov's first experiment was actually to ring a bell and cause his dog to attack Freud's cat, and that's where all of this got started. People think that's not what the textbooks say, but that's the truth. Now you know where it all got started. One of the things I'm very interested in, because counseling emerged out of a humanistic tradition, is I'm always interested in how students perceive behavioral interventions. And I think it's very common for counseling students to think about behavioral interventions as being very in opposition to humanistic perspectives and approaches to the counseling process. Years ago, I remember as a counseling student, I started to read Walden II, Skinner's book about what he described as a utopian behavioral environment, and how deeply disturbing that book was to me because everything was so deterministic. It certainly turned me off of behavioral interventions, but a lot of my early work was with adolescents, where people wanted behavior changes, and a lot of my later work has been with addictions where behavioral changes are sort of the starting point for any kind of intervention. And so I've grown to really appreciate how behavioral interventions can in fact be done that way. And in fact, I would encourage you to ask me about a case that I saw when I was teaching at Mississippi State, where I saw how badly behavioral interventions could be done in a very deterministic way. I'm not going to take the time to tell you that story now, but if you're interested, ask me and I'll tell you in class. But I've also really grown to see how compassionately and humanistically behavioral interventions can be implemented in a way that's not the least bit deterministic or inconsistent with humanistic tradition. So I also think it's important that we're talking here about identifying clients for whom behavior change is the primary goal. And so we see clients come in who want to stop smoking, or who want to make dietary changes, or want to begin exercising, or want to begin a mindfulness practice, and they want to make behavior changes, and that's the focal point of this. As we talked about in class, we're always trying to decide, are there cognitive processes that are underneath the behavioral issues that need to be addressed, and are there emotional issues under that? But at least on the surface, we're targeting behavior change in these instances. And so the starting point for this work is to really take the time to unpack the undesirable behavior, collect a baseline. We'll talk about that in the next slide and how we do that. But you want to really be as specific as you can about that. Lots of instances where the undesirable behavior was not really understood, and so interventions were misdirected and misguided. You've got to start with really understanding what's going on with the individual. You also want to make sure, as we've been talking about, that the client really wants to make this change, that they're clear that they want to make this change. If they're not, interventions will be doomed to fail. Where there's resistance, where there's ambivalence, we really need to use the ideas that we discussed from a motivational interviewing standpoint to address that first. A lot of mistakes that counselors make when they try to move forward with interventions for behavior change where there's still resistance or ambivalence. But where we have that desire to change, we start by getting this baseline on the undesirable behavior. It's the acronym FEDAS is very helpful here. And you won't use all of these all the time, but it's a good acronym to kind of have in your hip pocket when you're looking at a behavior. To think about the things that you might ask about. So you ask about frequency of the undesirable behavior. How often does it occur? How intense is it? So for example, someone describes an anxiety attack, and so how often they have those is very important, but also the intensity of those is very important. Is it mild? Is it absolutely something that just immobilizes the individual? And so you want to know about intensity in some instances as well. How long does it last? So, for example, I do a lot of work around behavioral addictions, and so someone tells me that they look at pornography on an average five nights a week. I want to know how long they're on for. There's a big difference between somebody who's looking at pornography for 20 minutes 5 times a week and somebody who's looking at pornography for 4 to 5 hours a night 5 times a week. So duration of the behavior is really, really important. Affect is important to assess what the person feels when they're engaging in the undesirable behavior, because often undesirable behaviors have the short-term effect of actually calming or distracting or helping them avoid some undesirable emotion. Then I also want to know about their emotion right after the behavior ends. Do they feel ashamed of it? Well, I did that again. Or I said I wasn't going to do that, or I wasn't going to do it like that. And so they feel this sense of shame about that. We also want to look at social context. For those of you in the schools, this is particularly important. So do problem behaviors occur at home only, at school only, or both places? If there's a problematic behavior in the schools, does it only occur in one class period? Would be an example of social context. What's going on in that environment that's actually influencing this behavior? So we collect all this information in a very detailed way to get some baseline information. And then we begin to set goals. And although it's a bit cliched and kind of overused, a good way to think about goals is that they need to be specific. They need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, they need to be realistic, they need to be timely. So the SMART acronym is a pretty good measuring point for the goals that you set with clients. Are they specific enough and measurable so that you and the client will know when that goal has been reached? It's not open to interpretation, it's very clear, it's objective. Is it achievable? Clients for whom we establish or co-establish, co-construct unrealistic goals, their self-efficacy probably is not very good. They don't feel like they're going to be able to meet those goals, and of course that's the death of effort to reach goals. They have to be realistic, and they also have to be timely. So sometimes we see long-term goals that are so long-term, we really need to build in some stepping stones, some shorter-term goals to help give them some shorter-term things to focus on, which will help them progress toward the longer-term goals. So it's important, I think, to develop a very transparent contract which talks about those goals once they've been established. If you're setting up some sort of contingency around rewards or consequences, which you would not want to do if the behavior was intrinsically rewarding, there's actually some evidence that adding extrinsic rewards to behavior that's intrinsically rewarding actually can decrease the behavior. It actually takes away the joy of the intrinsic reward. It sort of waters that down. So, but if there needs to be a contingency system, extrinsic rewards or consequences, then those need to be very, very clearly spelled out. Nothing will sabotage this more than a client thinking there was going to be a certain consequence to a behavior and you being on a different page with that. It feels very unfair, particularly if you're working with children or adolescents. You will have a problem if that happens. So you'll be very, very clear about that. I actually recommend putting it in writing. I think it makes it very explicit. It makes it very clear. You're wanting the client's buy-in on all of this, so assuming they're old enough to read a contract like this, written in age-appropriate language, developmentally appropriate language if they have limited education, then I think you really want to make sure that you've got that kind of buy-in, and putting that in writing can actually help with that. I do this with clients quite a bit, actually, and I just frame it as wanting to make sure we're on the same page and working in the same direction. So part of talking about, once we have a goal set, one of the things that I think it's very helpful to talk about and often underutilized is talking about obstacles to what could get in the way of you working toward this goal. And as people begin to identify potential obstacles, you begin to talk about ways that they can move through or move around or work beyond those obstacles. So you sort of anticipate those with the client, and you build in a plan for addressing those obstacles when they occur. So for example, someone wants to start exercising and they talk about how tired they are at the end of the workday and how they often have good intentions of exercising but then don't. You can begin to talk about ways that they could look for another time to work out or find a workout partner that would create some accountability, for example, just to begin to deal with those obstacles. At that point, you now have a goal, you have a contract, you've looked at the obstacles for the behavior change, and now you're really beginning to do interventions. And so I'm always asking myself, does the person have the necessary skill set to do this? Do I need to help them build some skills and some self-efficacy around this? So what does the intervention actually look like? And if we could do a whole course on behavioral interventions and spend an entire class period on the next few bullet points. But just to give you some sense about that, we want to instill in them a sense of self-efficacy, self-advocacy, that they are in a position to work toward their goals in a way that's meaningful for them and realistic for them. We know that sometimes visualizing a goal can be very helpful, so we might actually do I often, when people are working on behavioral changes, early on I'll do some visualization work about visualizing themselves having made the behavior change, having already engaged in and reached their goals, so that they begin to see what that looks like and what that feels like as a stepping stone towards beginning to enact those changes. Sometimes we just need to practice the rehearsal. So someone wants to be more assertive in a conversation with a boss, for example, we might practice that in the counseling session. If they seem to be approximating the desired behaviors, we could do a behavior rehearsal where they're practicing being themselves, and we might role play being the boss, for example. But if they're really far removed from the targeted behaviors, that's not going to be helpful, and they might actually need some social modeling. So we could have them role play the boss, and we would be them, so that we could model some of the desired behaviors. So how you set up that role play would depend to some extent on how much the behaviors needed modeling and shaping. Any kind of role playing is good. Again, the modeling piece is very, very important. Behavior rehearsal, let me go back up to the previous bullet point. I should probably add, it's not just role playing, but also sometimes it's going out and acting as if. So a very common homework assignment in this work would be, so at one point this week for X number of hours, 2, 3, 4 hours, I want you to act as if you've already met your goals. I just want you to engage in the behaviors that you would be doing if you had already met your goals. And so you begin to practice those new behaviors. So it can be, behavior rehearsal not only includes role playing in session, but also outside of session, just to clarify that. Skill development, if there are specific skills that they need to work on, going to classes, working with a coach in some particular type of skill, or we might do that ourselves to help them begin to build a specific set of skills that will help them meet their goals. So for example, a common example of this that I think is grossly underused in counseling work is relaxation. That we can build a plan for a client to help them learn how to relax if we feel like stress is something that's an obstacle to them meeting their goals. We can help clients by breaking down their goals into action steps, small things where they can take concrete action that begins to approximate or take steps towards their goal. Oftentimes people set sort of lofty goals and really don't do that, and so we can be helpful in that way. I think it's important that we always are talking about the possibilities with clients. So this idea of possibility language is what kinds of things will be possible for them once they have met their goals. So what are the incentives? What are the advantages of moving toward this as a way to keep them motivated to continue making progress towards their goals? And as I've already mentioned, relaxation I think is a pretty underused intervention that has a lot of application for a lot of different situations. And we'll talk a little bit more about systematic desensitization as a specific type of intervention. And as we're making this intervention, because we've got specific goals that are measurable, we can, on an ongoing basis, we can collect data. We can see how they're doing and what kinds of progress they're making towards their goals. If they're not making progress towards their goals, that's feedback that maybe our intervention is missing something somewhere. So we begin to go back and look at the intervention and see if there might be something else that we can do to help them make progress towards their goals. So we revise the contract. Maybe the goal shifts a little bit. Maybe it changes as we get into the process, or maybe our interventions need to be revised. So one type of behavioral work is functional assessment and analysis, and the assessment piece of it is collecting preliminary data, and the analysis is sometimes called by behaviorists an experiment. to see how we can impact the behavior. But the basic premise is that we can't understand behavior in a vacuum. It has to be examined within the context of antecedent conditions, things that are going on just prior to the behavior, and consequences of the behavior. And so, for example, a client with a drinking problem, they might say, well, I'm not going to drink tonight, but then they start to feel anxious. That might be the antecedent condition. And they know that having a few drinks will calm that anxiety. They start to drink, and they drink way too much, as they are prone to do. And then the consequence is that they lose the evening. They feel really bad the next day. Maybe they miss work. Maybe they're literally physically ill. Those would be examples of the consequences. So there are both short and long-term consequences in that example, because in the short term, yes, they start to drink and they no longer feel anxious. And that's the immediate consequence of that. But there's some short-term positive consequences, but larger and longer-term negative consequences. But we would understand the drinking behavior in the context of anxiety and the reduction of anxiety as antecedents and immediate consequences. So behavior has different functions. There are different sets of functions of behavior that are listed, but behaviorists typically talk about engaging in behavior to get attention, to avoid something. That's the example I just gave about drinking, to avoid the anxiety, to get a tangible reward. This is the kid in the kids don't have tantrums in the produce aisle. They have tantrums in the cookie aisle and the sugary cereal aisle to get something. So they want a tangible reward. And then self-stimulation, and we don't see this very often. This is often for people with more severe sorts of disabilities, although certainly, for example, if you're working in the schools, one of the things you're going to encounter is young children who are engaging in masturbatory behavior. But it often has an avoidance function of avoiding some sort of dysphoric mood like anxiety. If you looked at the Adlerian functions of behavior, they're a little bit different than this, so there are different opinions and perspectives about the exact functions of behavior, but this is a pretty good list when you're working from a behavioral framework. So the assessment part of it is the idea is that the very same behavior, so a kid gets into lots of fights in school, for example, the same behavior can have very different functions for different clients. And to understand how to intervene, we have to understand the function of that behavior, because the strongest reinforcer for a desired behavior is whatever is reinforcing the undesirable behavior. So, for example, if the function of getting into a fight is attention, then the strongest reinforcer for not fighting is going to be attention. So what you see a lot of times is people will set up a contingency system where they give people tangible rewards for the desired behavior, but that's not necessarily a strong reinforcer. You see token economies do this all the time, where people get points or they get small gifts for engaging in desired behaviors. But if what is reinforcing the undesirable behavior is attention, for example, it's probably not going to work. It's almost guaranteed that it's going to fail. So we want to find out what's reinforcing the undesirable behavior and try to use that as a reinforcer for the desirable behavior. And we want to look at the possibility that we want to have a good contingency system that has lots of different types of reinforcers. In fact, a really good token economy, if you worked in a group home or a residential home, for example, would have reinforcers that were attention, avoidance, tangible rewards, so that people, and in fact, the residents could choose from the types of reinforcers that they wanted, so they would choose what was most reinforcing for them. So one of the things that I think we can often do that gets underutilized a lot is self-monitoring, asking clients to self-monitor in a certain way. And this can be self-monitoring specific behaviors, like, for example, if someone at baseline, they're not able to tell you how many beers they drink when they go out, you can ask them. It's very common, and you see people do this probably in bars, asking the wait staff not to take away their empties. That becomes how they keep track of how many drinks that they've had. Or we'll have people sometimes put a little golf pencil on a piece of paper in their pack of cigarettes, and they monitor how many cigarettes they smoke that way. But it can also be things, it can be more internal states like negative thoughts that one has, negative self-talk, for example. You can create a system where people can very sort of simply self-monitor. So it involves observing behaviors, whether they're external behaviors or internal behaviors, and creating some kind of simple self-recording that's as unobtrusive as possible. Because there's this interesting idea called reactivity. And that is technically self-observation and self-recording, for example, is an assessment. It's a way to collect data. It's a way to know what the baseline behaviors are. But the beauty of this is that often with behaviors, when people begin to self-observe and self-record, thereby self-monitoring, they actually begin to change the behaviors just from that process. Because they become more conscious and more aware when they're doing something, and they can begin to make changes out of that higher level of consciousness. So we also sometimes self-monitoring becomes a homework assignment. That's something that we ask people if they would be willing to do. It can be useful in many regards. But also asking them to go out and practice behaviors, to engage in certain types of tasks that might help strengthen their skills around something. Those are all examples. The point being, we don't do all of this in the counseling session. There's often some work outside of the session to begin to make progress on these behavioral goals. And you've probably heard of the Premack principle. The classic example is if you've got two pieces of reading to do and one of them you're really excited about and one of them you really dislike, you do the one you dislike first and then you use the other as a reward for that. And so you can often think of ways, especially with younger students, where you can set up a Premack principle where desired tasks are used as reinforcement for other tasks. I want to talk just a little bit about systematic desensitization because this is a very specific behavioral intervention that can be very concrete. It's actually counter-conditioning for any kind of specific stimulus fear, so any kind of phobia. So people have a bad car wreck and they're conditioned to have anxiety when they're driving, or people get in the water, and even shallow water sometimes have a fear of drowning, fear of flying in planes, arachnophobia, fear of spiders, or fear of social situations. But there's a specific stimulus that you're looking at. There's a specific condition which causes anxiety or fear for the individual. And so we would treat that using behavioral intervention known as systematic desensitization, and I'll walk you through how you do that. So there are three major components. The first is training in deep muscle relaxation or other forms of getting some sort of relaxation response, hence the dog. We know that when people are, unless they have a phobia of dogs or an allergy to dogs, that if they like dogs, they actually, petting a dog actually elicits a relaxation response. But in counseling, we're probably going to do progressive muscle relaxation. Those scripts are readily available on the internet, or there are guided progressive muscle relaxation audio clips readily available on the internet. But we can use those and have the client, we can do that in session, but we can also have the client practice that at home. And then we work with a client usually to generate about 10 to 20 items. It's a constructed hierarchy. So for example, we might have, if someone has a fear of flying, we might have thinking about an upcoming trip, booking a flight, packing your suitcase to go to the airport, driving to the airport, parking your car, walking into the terminal, checking in, going through security, sitting in the waiting area for the plane, boarding the plane, listening to the pre-flight instructions, feeling the plane being pushed back from the gate, taxiing down the runway, takeoff. And each of those would have, as you can imagine, each of those would progressively have provoke a different level of emotion for the person. You usually want to come up with about 10 to 20 items. And these can be things that they actually do, or they can be things that they just imagine doing. So they may not be going to take a flight, but they want to get over their fear of flying. So all of that would just be imaginal. They have no upcoming trip, and obviously without a trip coming up, you can't actually walk through those steps in that example. And then over time, what we do, and I'll unpack this in the next few slides in more detail, but we begin to pair that hierarchy with muscle relaxation. So it's classic counter conditioning. You're taking the anxiety-provoking stimuli, and you're pairing it with a relaxation response so that it no longer is paired with anxiety. So we typically use what's called a SUD scale, a subjective units of discomfort. It's a 100-point scale, 0 being completely relaxed and 100 points being coming out of your skin. And after we've created the hierarchy, we rate each item, or we have the client rate each item on that hierarchy. And so part of what we're doing is making sure we have them in the right order, for example. And if there's too much of a jump in the items, it's probably it's a bit like a gap in a bridge. You could fall through there. So you want to, if somebody has a SUDS unit or an item that's at a 30 and the next lowest one's at a 50, for example, you probably want to see if there's some imagined or real behavior in between those 2 points that would come in around a 40 that would help you sort of fill in those gaps a little bit. And then you agree on a signal process. What's typically commonly used as you're going through this process with a client, they're often sitting in your office with their eyes closed and their hands in their lap, and so they just raise one finger. You don't want to have words because you want them really attending to their internal process. So a slight raise of the hand or raised index finger is the cue that the client is feeling anxiety. And so then what you do is you induce relaxation as you begin the systematic desensitization session. And you imagine, you begin, of course, with item 1 on the hierarchy, and you ask them to imagine that for about 10 seconds. You just visualize in your mind, da-da-da-da-da. And then you have them imagine a pleasant scene and engage in their relaxation response for about 30 seconds. And then you go back to the first anxiety item for about 30 seconds. If there's no noticeable increase in anxiety, then you begin to move on up the hierarchy. And so you're pairing this anxiety with a relaxation response. But you're not going to go through all 10 or 20 items in one session. You're going to move, you may only move through an item or two because you want them to be able to visualize the behavior without experiencing anxiety. So how fast you move really depends on their level of anxiety and how quickly they can induce a relaxation response. Often you have to go through a particular item on the hierarchy multiple times. Researchers have found typically about 3 to 10 before they get that SUD score down really, really, really low and they're ready to move on to the next item in the hierarchy. So this takes some time. It doesn't happen quickly. You have to be patient. If it takes more than 10 repetitions with an item, there's a possibility that you need some item in between that one and the one below it. So you might go back and look at your hierarchy and see there might be something that's missing that you could fill in to work on to help them move forward with their relaxation. Sometimes you might do items 1, 2, and 3, let's say, in one session, but that doesn't mean you come back to the next session and you start at 4. It might be a check-in with the client. Where do you think we could start? Could we start with item number 2 on your hierarchy? Would that feel okay to you? Or you might even do 1, but you would move through them more quickly and maybe get through 4 and maybe 5 in the next session. So the idea is you often have to kind of loop back on yourself a little bit as you're moving forward. It's far from a strictly linear process. And when the client signals anxiety, whether that's a raised finger or a raised hand, I usually just use a raised finger, you immediately stop and go to relaxation. You want to get ahead of the storm. You don't want people's anxiety to start taking off. As soon as they start feeling some anxiety, go to the relaxation response. And that's why you can't force this. You can't rush this. If you let them have some anxiety and you move on, typically the next item on the hierarchy, their anxiety is just really going to build. And you've gotten behind. It's a little bit like how people talk about pain medication. You want to stay ahead of the pain. Here you want to use relaxation to stay ahead of the anxiety. So if there's anxiety, you immediately go into letting go of that image and practicing relaxation. And you want to, when people say there's no anxiety, you want to avoid the value judgments on that, because when you say, they say, oh, no, there's no anxiety there, and you say good, you're actually saying that's the right answer, and you can get people to start telling you that they don't feel any anxiety when they actually do feel low levels of anxiety. You almost create kind of a socially desirable response, which can be problematic because you're working with bad data at that point. So that's our talk, and I look forward to any questions that you might have, obviously done fairly quickly, but I look forward to questions that you might have in class. Thank you.